Before we begin, take a quiet moment. If you grew up hearing stories of the war, of ration books, blackouts, and the rumble of bombers overhead, this one's for you. Like, comment, and subscribe to Ghosts of WWII so these voices, these memories, never fade. At first they laughed. Even among their own ranks, the idea sounded absurd. Men in rubber boats sneaking into occupied Europe under the cover of night, armed with knives, demolition charges, and an appetite for danger. Suicidal, some called it. A sideshow. The Germans, for their part, didn't bother laughing. They dismissed it altogether. The British, they thought, had run out of conventional courage. It was the summer of 1940, and Britain stood alone. France had fallen. Dunkirk had emptied the beaches of hope and men alike. Across the Channel, Hitler prepared Operation Sea Lion, his grand plan to invade England itself. The island was bleeding, but not broken, and somewhere in that bleeding heart, a new kind of soldier was being forged. In a smoky room at Whitehall, Prime Minister Winston Churchill tapped his cigar against a map of the French coast and uttered a sentence that would change warfare forever. "We shall set Europe ablaze." Those 5 words gave birth to something entirely new. Small bands of raiders who would strike by sea and vanish before dawn. Not infantry, not sailors, commandos. The first volunteers came from every corner of Britain. Farmers, fishermen, miners, boxers, misfits. Men restless for revenge. They trained in the Highlands of Scotland, where the nights froze and the hills broke the weak. They learned to climb cliffs in silence, to kill without hesitation, to survive without comfort. Their motto, whispered through clenched teeth, was simple: "United we conquer." Even their own commanders doubted them. "They'll never make a difference," one general scoffed. "A few men in canoes can't win a war." But Churchill knew better. He knew that morale mattered as much as munitions. That Britain needed proof its spirit was still sharp. The Commandos would be that proof. Their first raids were clumsy, desperate improvisations, small landings along the Norwegian coast, explosions that made headlines but changed little. But every operation taught them something new: how to fight dirty, how to think like hunters, how to turn fear into fuel. By 1942, the Germans no longer laughed. In occupied France, the word commando was whispered like a curse. Posters warned civilians, "Beware the British terror troops." The raid that changed everything began on a cold November night. Operation Chariot, the attack on the port of Saint-Nazaire. Saint-Nazaire was no ordinary harbor. It held the only dry dock on the Atlantic large enough to repair the German battleship Tirpitz, sister to the Bismarck. If the Allies could destroy that dock, the Tirpitz would be trapped in northern waters, useless for the rest of the war. The plan was audacious. Some said insane: sail a destroyer packed with explosives straight into the dock gates, ram it, and detonate the ship from within. The vessel chosen for the job was the HMS Campbelltown, an old American Lend-Lease destroyer modified to resemble a German ship. Her hull was packed with 4.5 tons of explosives, disguised under layers of concrete and steel. Around her, a flotilla of motor launches carried 611 commandos and sailors. Most were under 30, some barely 20. All knew the odds. As the Campbelltown approached the French coast, German searchlights swept the water. The British sent false recognition signals, pretending to be friendly craft. It worked for a few minutes. Then the Germans opened fire. Tracers ripped across the black water. The Campbelltown shuddered, her hull splintering under cannon fire. But she kept going, full speed, straight at the dock gates. Aboard, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty gripped the wheel and shouted over the roar, "Hold her steady!" Moments later, the ship slammed into the gates at 20 knots, metal shrieking, the bow buried deep in the dock. Beatty turned to his men and said quietly, "We've done it." But the night was far from over. Under withering fire, the commandos stormed ashore. They fought through the port, planting explosives on fuel tanks, cranes, and warehouses Germans poured from barracks, rifles blazing. The docks became a labyrinth of muzzle flashes and smoke. Hand grenades rolled underfoot. The air tasted of cordite and salt. Captain Ryder, the operations commander, radioed one final message back to Britain. "Commando attack successful. Fighting continues." At dawn, with ammunition running low, the survivors surrendered. Many believed they had failed, that their effort had been brave but futile. The Germans mocked them, parading the captured men through the streets. An officer sneered, "Was it worth it, Englander?" Then at 10:35 a.m., the harbor shook. The HMS Campbelltown, forgotten, silent, her crew long captured or dead, detonated. 4.5 tons of hidden explosives tore through the dock gates and sent a tidal wave of debris across the port. The explosion killed more than 300 German soldiers and obliterated the only dock capable of servicing the Tirpitz. The Campbelltown was gone, but she took the heart of the Kriegsmarine's Atlantic repair network with her. Word of the blast spread through Britain like fire through dry grass. The newspapers called it the greatest raid of all. The men who'd been mocked for suicidal stunts had just crippled Hitler's navy without a single aircraft or battleship. In Berlin, the laughter stopped. Goebbels' propaganda ministry tried to spin the event as a minor act of sabotage. But even the German high command knew the truth. The British Commandos had proven that no harbor, no fortress, no coastline was safe. From then on, they'd live in fear of the next explosion in the night. For the men who survived Saint-Nazaire, the cost was steep. 169 dead, 215 captured. Yet they spoke of it not with sorrow, but pride. One commando years later would say, "We didn't just destroy a dock, we destroyed their sense of safety." If you're watching this now and you remember that generation, the ones who fought when the odds were impossible, honor them. Like this video, subscribe to Ghosts of WW2, and share it with someone who still believes courage can come in small numbers. Because that night, on a foreign shore, a handful of men proved that laughter is short-lived, but bravery, real bravery, can echo for centuries. For those who remember, this part will hit home. By the winter of 1942, the word commando had taken on a life of its own. Not quite soldier, not quite sailor. These men lived in the blurred space between they moved by night, struck without warning, and disappeared before the echo of battle faded. What began as a desperate experiment after Dunkirk was becoming a doctrine, a new language of war, written in stealth, surprise, and the cold salt spray of the Channel. The Highlands of Scotland shaped them. At Achnacarry, recruits ran through obstacle courses carved into rock and pine. They climbed cliffs slick with ice, crossed rivers in frigid water up to their chests, and marched endless miles with packs that dug into their shoulders like iron claws. The instructors, many of them battle-hardened veterans, believed that a commando should be capable of doing what ordinary soldiers could not. "If you're comfortable," one training sergeant growled, "you're doing it wrong." The nights were the hardest. Fog rolled through the glens like a living thing, swallowing sound and sense alike. Recruits practiced landing operations in complete darkness, jumping from assault craft into icy surf with no light to guide them. More than one man vanished into the black water, never to be seen again. But those who endured emerged with a quiet confidence, the kind that comes only from surviving the impossible. They weren't the biggest men or the strongest, but they were the most stubborn, the type who would keep climbing even when the mountain itself told them to quit. And slowly, the Germans began to notice. The raids along the French coast grew bolder. Small parties of commandos slipped ashore at night, destroyed radar stations, seized documents, and withdrew before dawn. They struck at Vagzo, at Lofoten, at Dieppe. The Germans, outraged that their massive coastal defenses could be pierced by a few dozen men with wire cutters and explosives, issued a chilling directive. It became known as the Commando Befehl, the Commando Order. Hitler himself signed it. Any commando captured, even if in uniform, was to be executed immediately. No trial, no rights. To the commandos, it was almost a compliment. "If he wants us dead that badly," one joked grimly, "we must be doing something right." But the stakes had changed. Every raid now meant stepping into a shadow where capture was a death sentence. And still, they volunteered. One of the earliest large-scale operations after Saint-Nazaire was the raid on Dieppe. Official history remembers it as a disaster, and rightly so. But hidden within the chaos was a truth the Germans rarely admitted. Even when surrounded, the commandos fought with a ferocity that stunned the defenders. At 4:52 in the pale morning light, Number 4 Commando landed east of the main beach. Their objective: silence the coastal battery at Varengeville. As the Royal Navy shelled the cliffs above, the commandos climbed steep slopes under fire, moving with the practiced fluidity of men who had rehearsed every step, every breath. Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovat, tall, composed, and impossibly calm, led from the front, his bagpiper, Bill Millen, marching beside him in full kilt. To the Germans, it was madness. To the commandos, it was tradition. Above the roar of artillery, Millen played Highland Laddie as bullets sliced the air around him. One German prisoner later said, "We didn't shoot him. We thought he had gone insane." By mid-morning, the battery was destroyed, its guns shattered by timed explosives. The commandos withdrew in good order, one of the few Allied units that achieved its objective that day. Their discipline under fire earned the respect of even their harshest critics. The commandos weren't supermen. They were simply unyielding. Word of their skill spread throughout German ranks. A captured officer confessed to British interrogators that the commandos were feared out of proportion to their numbers. "We never know where they will strike," he said. "Your planes we can track. Your tanks we can trap. But your commandos," he shook his head, "they come from the sea like ghosts." That reputation wasn't earned through theatrics. It came from nights of silent approach, from hours spent lying in cold marshes waiting for a signal, from the grim reality that a single misstep could doom an entire raiding force. But no raid demonstrated their precision more clearly than the destruction of the Normandy dry dock at Saint-Nazaire. After the Campbelltown exploded, the Germans were forced to divert ships thousands of miles for repairs. The Tirpitz, Hitler's prized battleship, never sailed into the North Atlantic for fear it had nowhere to return. A handful of commandos had accomplished what fleets of bombers could not. In Berlin, the blow was psychological as much as logistical. Hitler raged at the humiliation. His generals tightened coastal defenses. Entire divisions were repositioned because of the threat of British raiders. The joke once told in German barracks, "The British send mosquitoes to sting giants," was heard no more. Back in Britain, the commandos returned to base, battered, depleted, and proud. Many of them carried wounds they'd never speak of. Burns from explosions, shrapnel buried deep, memories even sharper. But when asked if they would do it again, every man answered the same. "Aye, tomorrow night if needed." If you're watching this and you remember that stubborn courage, the generation that kept fighting even when the world called them finished, honor them. Like this video, subscribe to Ghosts of World War II, and pass this story to someone who understands sacrifice. Because these men didn't just raid ports, they raided despair itself, and proved that even the smallest force can reshape history when guided by bravery. For those who remember, they didn't just lose ground that year. They lost belief. By 1943, the Commandos had become something more than a military unit. They were a rumor, a shadow, a whispered warning in every German garrison from Denmark to Brittany. "Stay alert," officers muttered. "The English ghosts may come tonight." And the Germans were right to fear the night, because the night belonged to the Commandos. The success at Saint-Nazaire had rattled the Wehrmacht. They had learned the hard way that ports defended by hundreds could still fall to a few dozen determined men who slipped in quietly and vanished before sunrise. The Germans reinforced docks, doubled patrols, and strung barbed wire across beaches. Searchlight crews drilled relentlessly, sweeping the coastlines for shapes in the surf. But shadows don't respect walls, and the Commandos thrived in shadows. One operation in early '43, Operation Frankton, terrified the German Naval Command like few others. The British public heard little about it at the time, but in German memos, the raid was described as deeply unsettling. 10 commandos paddled 5 collapsible canoes, tiny craft barely more than canvas stretched over aluminum ribs, into the mouth of the Gironde estuary. Their target, the port of Bordeaux, home to some of the most important U-boat supply ships and blockade runners in the Atlantic War. The mission demanded something close to lunacy. Paddle by night for miles upriver through freezing tidewater, past German patrol boats, then slip into the harbor and attach limpet mines beneath enemy freighters. The men set off from a submarine. Within hours, currents overturned 2 canoes, sweeping 4 men to their deaths. The survivors pushed on, their hands blistered, their bodies numb, their gear soaked. One canoe struck debris, tearing open a seam. Rather than abandon the mission, the 2 commandos used bootlaces and rags to patch the hole, then kept paddling. When they finally reached the harbor after days of effort, they planted their explosives with steady hands, each man working with the quiet focus of someone who knew this might be his final act. As they slipped back into the river, engines roared behind them. The German patrols had spotted one of the mines. A series of detonations tore through the docks. Flames leapt into the night sky as 6 Axis ships were crippled or destroyed. Only 2 commandos made it out of France alive, but the damage they caused forced the Germans to divert entire fleets for repair and reposition vital shipping routes, a ripple that shaped convoy battles thousands of miles away. Berlin was furious. Hitler issued yet another directive to his coastal commanders: expect anything, expect them anywhere. Fear became a weapon the commandos never had to carry. They instilled it simply by existing. But behind every raid, every bold stroke painted across a map, there were men, young, exhausted, often trembling in the dark before the jump, the climb, the landing. They were not immune to fear. They mastered it, bent it, carried it like another piece of kit on their backs. One commando from No. 11 Scottish Troop wrote home after a raid that nearly killed him. "We are not fearless, Mother. We are frightened every time. The trick is to move before the fear catches you." It was a sentiment echoed across dozens of letters, quiet admissions of humanity behind the legends. In England, the public began to follow their exploits. Newspapers printed bold headlines whenever a new raid succeeded. "Commandos strike again." "Nazi coast feels Britain's sting." Men in pubs raised glasses to them, mothers prayed for them. Children read comic book versions of their adventures. But no headline could capture the exhaustion that lived in their bones. Between operations, they returned to Scotland to train again. No rest, no indulgence. On rainy nights, the mountains echoed with the bark of instructors urging tired legs up rocky slopes. "Another mile," they'd say. "You don't get to be ordinary." Ordinary was something the commandos had left behind long ago. One of the darkest moments of the entire war came in late 1942 when a small force landed near the town of Sark in the Channel Islands. The raid itself was minor, a quick sabotage mission. But when German bodies were found with their hands tied, Berlin claimed the commandos had executed prisoners. Churchill denied it, insisting the men had acted in accordance with the laws of war. The truth became lost in the fog of conflict. But the incident hardened attitudes on both sides. The commando order was enforced even more brutally. Captured raiders disappeared. Sometimes their bodies washed up weeks later along the coast. Sometimes they never did. Still, the commandos kept going. They had to. Because as 1943 gave way to 1944, something larger began to form, the shape of the final blow against Nazi Europe. The commandos would be needed again, this time not for raids, but for a vast assault on a fortress continent. D-Day was coming, and the men who once specialized in silent landings and pinpoint strikes would soon be storming beaches under daylight fire, not dozens of them, but thousands. The Germans, blind to the details of Allied planning, still remembered Saint-Nazaire, still remembered Bordeaux, still remembered the quiet whispers of sabotage that had haunted their command posts for months. So when their intelligence officers saw reports of commando activity across the Channel, training intensifying, units growing, they grew uneasy. If the British Commandos are active, one German colonel warned, then the invasion is closer than we think. He was right, very right. If you're watching this and you remember those days, the blackout curtains, the ration books, the wireless humming late at night, then you know how heavy the air felt before 1944. If you haven't yet, like this video and subscribe to Ghosts of WWII, because these stories aren't just history, they're inheritance. They belong to you, your parents, your grandparents. And as the world stood at the edge of its darkest night, the commandos prepared for the dawn that would follow. For those who remember, to this day, some of them never spoke of what they saw on those lonely shores. By early 1944, the commandos could feel the shift in the wind. The raids were becoming fewer. The targets were different. The secrecy was heavier. Something large, something unmistakable, was forming behind the silence of British planning rooms. The men knew it before anyone told them. You don't train that hard, that long, without sensing a storm coming. And every commando felt the pressure drop. For years, they had been the scalpel, small groups slicing vital arteries in Hitler's war machine. But now, the Allies needed something else. They needed a hammer. Still, before that hammer fell, there were missions to complete. The last flickers of the commando raiding war that had defined them since 1940. One of the most daring took place on a barren finger of land in Normandy, the Brunewald Raid. The target was an advanced German radar installation perched on a cliff, protected by machine guns and high walls. For weeks, British bombers had noticed a strange, unbreakable accuracy in German air defenses. Someone needed to get inside that station and steal the radar equipment itself. Who else could they send but the commandos? They landed at midnight. The sea was black glass beneath the cliffs. Paratroopers hit the ground first, cutting German telephone lines and taking out guards with silent precision. Then the commandos stormed the radar station, smashing through doors, ripping out equipment, and hauling it to the beach. German reinforcements scrambled to respond, too late. A Royal Navy boat slid in through the surf, loaded the stolen radar components, and vanished into the night. The mission stunned the Germans. Hitler raged that no fortress was safe, no technology untouchable. It was the last time the commandos struck with their old style, small, sharp, surgical. Because the next time they crossed the Channel, they'd be stepping into the biggest invasion in human history. The commandos prepare for the impossible. Back in Britain, the camps buzzed with rumors. New uniforms, new equipment, new secrecy. Whole units vanished from the highlands overnight, relocated to the southern coast. Training intensified into something almost inhuman. Men ran endless beach assaults, sprinting across sand with full kit, leaping over obstacles as live ammunition snapped overhead. They practiced climbing ropes wet with seawater. They learned how to storm bunkers, clear trenches, fire flamethrowers, and guide tanks through narrow openings. The commandos weren't being prepared for a raid anymore. They were being prepared for liberation. Some sensed it in their bones. Others heard whispers. Normandy, the French coast, June. Most kept their thoughts to themselves. One commando from number 6 wrote in his diary, "We trained for death. We hoped for victory. We expected neither." Many of these men had seen more combat in 2 years than most armies see in a lifetime. Their eyes were older now. Their hands shook in the mornings. Their hair had silver streaks that weren't there at Dunkirk, but they were ready. The Germans wait for shadows. Across the Channel, German forces waited behind the concrete teeth of the Atlantic Wall. Rommel himself paced the beaches, insisting that the next Allied blow would come at Pas de Calais. They believed this so deeply that they misread the signs in Normandy. Camouflage that was too good. Silence that was too complete. Small commando reconnaissance teams that came and went in the night. German officers muttered nervously when they found footprints in the sand where no patrol had reported activity. One bunker commander wrote, "The English ghosts have returned. This is a bad omen." He was right, but the commandos weren't ghosts anymore. They were the tip of a spear aimed at Europe's throat. The night before D-Day. On June 5th, the commando units assigned to the invasion gathered near their landing craft. Some smoked in silence. Some wrote last letters home. Some slept, or pretended to. In one tent, a chaplain prayed over the men. He didn't read from scripture. He simply said, "Be steady, be brave, be good." The commandos nodded. They understood. They had lived those words since 1940. As the tide turned and the moon hung low, the men boarded their landing craft. Engines hummed. Seawater slapped against hulls. Tension vibrated through the air like tuning wire. Many of the older viewers watching this now may remember the radio broadcasts that followed, the coded messages, the hints, the tightening in your chest as the realization struck. This was the beginning of the end. If you remember that night, or if you grew up hearing about it, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe to Ghosts of WWII. It's not for numbers, it's to keep the memory breathing. The commandos hit the beaches. When the first rays of dawn broke across Normandy on June 6, 1944, the commandos hit the sand with the ferocity of men who had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. They stormed Sword Beach under machine gun fire so dense it looked like rain. They took out pillboxes with grenades and bayonets. They guided wounded soldiers to cover while calling in naval fire on German strongpoints. Lord Lovat stepped onto the beach in his green beret, unafraid, followed by his piper, Bill Millen, playing as bullets snapped past him. The sound of his bagpipes carried across the beach like defiance made music. To the Germans, it was madness. To the commandos, it was identity. To history, it became legend. They pushed inland faster than any other British unit. Their job, link up with airborne troops at Pegasus Bridge. If they failed, the flank of the entire invasion could collapse. But they didn't fail. They never did. By noon, sweating, bleeding, exhausted, they reached the airborne men and shook their hands. A paratrooper later said, "When the commandos arrived, we knew we'd live to see sundown." What came after? The commandos fought through France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and into Germany. Their raids became battles. Their missions became liberations. Their legend became unshakable. But the cost followed them home. Some never slept soundly again. Some never spoke of the war. Some never came home at all. For those who remember, you know that silence. You know that weight. And the world remembers because of you, because you keep watching, keep sharing, keep passing these stories down. By the autumn of 1944, the Commandos were no longer the unknown terrors of Churchill's early war vision. They were elite assault troops now, no longer slipping into enemy ports, but smashing through fortified towns, river crossings, and the jagged edge of the Reich itself. The men missed the old days sometimes, the black nights on the Channel, the adrenaline of a silent landing, the thrill of vanishing before the Germans knew what hit them. But war changes, and the Commandos changed with it. Now they marched beside armored columns. They cleared towns house by house. They crossed rivers under machine gun fire. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were the spearhead. And the cost kept rising. Operation Infiltrate, the hell of Walcheren. Nothing tested them more than the battle for Walcheren Island, a Dutch fortress of sand, sea walls, and sunken fields blocking access to the port of Antwerp. The Germans had turned it into a chokehold that strangled Allied supply lines. It had to be taken. And the job fell, once again, to the Commandos. They came in from the sea, riding landing craft into a storm of fire. German guns placed on concrete bunkers pounded the water with such precision that survivors swore the sea itself felt hostile, violent, alive, clawing at the boats. As the ramps dropped, the Commandos hit the surf, wading chest-deep through icy water under an avalanche of shells. One officer shouted, "Forward! Forward!" Another simply pointed to shore. He'd lost his voice screaming over the bombardment. The beach was a nightmare. Mud, smoke, bodies, debris. Men were cut down in the water before they could even lift their rifles. But those who reached the seawall dug in, returning fire with the cold concentration of veterans who had seen too much to hesitate. For hours they fought, inch by inch. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and seawater. At one point, a German officer reportedly screamed, "These are not soldiers. They are demons." He wasn't far off. The Commandos kept climbing, kept advancing, kept pushing into the teeth of the fortifications. By nightfall, they had taken the beachhead. 2 days later, the island was theirs, battered, flooded, but liberated. The port of Antwerp opened to Allied supply ships soon after. The Germans didn't laugh then either. Winter in the Low Countries. After Walcheren, the Commandos joined the fight through the Netherlands and Belgium. The Dutch still remember them. The men in green berets who arrived at dawn, rifle barrels steaming in the cold, faces streaked with mud. In Eindhoven, a local boy once asked a commando, "Are you really British?" The commando smiled and answered, "Half British, half stubbornness." The boy didn't understand the joke. But years later, he told his grandchildren about that smile. Because to people under occupation, the Commandos weren't myths. They were the first faces of freedom. Crossing into Germany. By early 1945, the Rhine River loomed, wide, fast, heavily defended. The Germans knew the Allies would cross it eventually. They just didn't know where. One night, under cloud cover, the Commandos launched a diversion raid on the east bank. Their goal wasn't to take ground. It was to draw fire, to make the Germans believe the crossing would happen there, not miles away where the real operation was underway. They set off in tiny boats, paddling into darkness as flares illuminated the sky like lightning frozen in place. Bullets struck the water in fountains of white spray, but the Commandos wouldn't break formation. They rode forward with the calm desperation of men buying time with their lives. When the Germans committed tens of thousands of troops to repel what they believed was the main assault, the Allies launched the true crossing upriver, nearly unopposed. The Commandos lost dozens that night. One of the survivors later said, "We didn't cross the Rhine, we helped the world cross it." What the war took from them. For all their victories, the Commandos paid dearly. Years of night raids, close-quarter fighting, and relentless training left scars the world never saw. Some carried shrapnel in their bodies until the day they died. Some couldn't sleep without the sound of rain hitting canvas. Some never spoke of the men who had vanished beside them in the surf or in the dark. But they held on to their humor, their dry, cutting, distinctly British humor, a badge of sanity in the madness. One commando joked at a reunion in the 1970s, "The Germans said they'd shoot us on sight. I always thought that was rather unsporting." The room roared with laughter, the heavy kind that only veterans share. But behind that laughter was memory, and behind that memory was loss. For those of you watching now, if you lived through those years, if your father or grandfather fought in North Africa, Italy, France, or Germany, you know that weight. You know the silence that followed men home from war. If you haven't already, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Ghosts of WW2, not for vanity, but for remembrance. Because the Commandos didn't fight for praise. They fought for a future they would rarely speak of, but always believed in. The last missions. As the war drew to a close, the Commandos liberated concentration camps, freed prisoners, and guarded bridges deep inside Germany. They were among the first Allied troops many survivors ever saw. One Jewish survivor, trembling and skeletal, asked a commando, "Are you angels?" The commando shook his head and said, "No, love. We're just late." Then he wrapped his coat around her shoulders. It was the simplest moment of the entire war, and perhaps the most human. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Commandos packed their gear one last time. They boarded trucks, boats, and trains. Some returned to fishing villages, some to farms, some to factories. Some simply drifted, unsure how to live without the adrenaline of the night raids. But all of them carried the same quiet truth. They had changed the outcome of a world at war. For those who remember, this part cuts deep. Because victory is loud, but aftermath is quiet. The war ended. The flags came out. The church bells rang, and the world exhaled for the first time in 6 long, brutal years. But for the Commandos, the men who had once slipped across the channel in silence, who had smashed through seawalls and climbed cliffs under fire, peace felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. Some returned home to cheers. Some returned to quiet kitchens where the kettle whistled and life resumed as if nothing had happened. Some returned to empty houses. Too many never returned at all. Their green berets were folded into drawers. Their battle-worn knives were tucked away in boxes. The sea, which had been their battlefield, became a place for walks with grandchildren or a view from a quiet pier. But their memories, those stayed sharp, sharper than the steel they once carried. And if you're watching this right now, if you lived through those years or heard the stories around a dinner table growing up, then you know. War fades, but memory doesn't. If you haven't yet, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Ghosts of WW2. This is how we keep their names alive. The Commandos after the war. In the decades that followed, many of the wartime commando units were disbanded. Britain reorganized its forces. New missions, new dangers, new wars. But the commando spirit did not disappear. It transformed. It evolved. It passed into the veins of future special forces, the Royal Marines Commandos, the Parachute Regiment, the SAS, the SBS. Every modern special operations soldier, British, American, Canadian, Australian, owes part of their legacy to those early raiders of 1940. The men who proved that a handful of determined fighters could shake an empire. And the Germans never forgot. Even decades later, former Wehrmacht officers spoke about the night terror the commandos created. One said in an interview, "I feared your commandos more than your bombers. A bomber can be tracked. A commando can appear anywhere." He wasn't exaggerating. Their reputation crossed borders, languages, oceans. But the commandos themselves, they didn't brag. Bragging wasn't in their blood. Men like Lord Lovett, Jack Churchill, and the countless unnamed corporals and privates who risked everything on freezing beaches simply went home and resumed life. Some became farmers, some became teachers, some drove buses, some carried secrets they never spoke aloud. One commando, interviewed in the 1980s, was asked how many Germans he had killed. He looked away and answered softly, "Enough to bring my men home, not one more." That was the truth of them. Not killers, protectors, not braggarts, brothers. The memories they carried. In the quiet evenings of their later years, many commandos spoke not of violence, but of moments of startling humanity. Sharing a cigarette with a French fisherman after a raid, hearing bagpipes on a beach while bullets snapped overhead. Seeing a Dutch family wave from a doorway as they passed through a liberated village, receiving fresh bread from an elderly woman who hadn't tasted freedom in 4 years. Those were the memories they cherished, not the explosions, not the danger, not the fear, but the glimpses of life returning. One veteran said it best, "We didn't fight to destroy. We fought so others could build again." He spent the last years of his life teaching local school children how to tie knots, how to read a map, how to show kindness. He said those skills mattered more. The last reunions. By the 2000s, the commando reunions grew smaller each year. A few old men in green berets gathered in community halls or seaside pubs, their steps slower, their voices softer. But when they saw each other, when they clasped hands, time folded. They were young again, just for a moment. At one reunion in Scotland, a young Royal Marines commando saluted an elderly veteran. "Sir," he said, "we stand on your shoulders." The old man smiled and replied, "Then stand tall." It was the last reunion he ever attended. His beret, lovingly preserved, sits on display in a glass case today. Faded, but unforgotten. A legacy that still breathes. If you go to Saint-Nazaire today, you can still see what the commandos did. The dock gates, rebuilt, the port, thriving. The scars of the explosion, preserved in photographs and memory. Each year, locals gather on the anniversary of Operation Chariot. They lay wreaths. They shake hands with the families of the men who came across the sea in the HMS Campbelltown. They speak softly, often in French-accented English. "Thank you. You saved us." In Normandy, along Sword Beach and the banks of the River Orne, plaques mark where the commandos landed on D-Day. Tourists walk past, unaware. But older visitors, the ones who know, the ones who lived it, stop and bow their heads. One elderly woman, interviewed during a commemoration in 2014, said, "I was 10 when they came up the road in their green berets. I thought they were angels." She paused, then added, "In a way, they were." The last words. As the final surviving wartime commandos passed away, historians asked what message they wanted the world to remember. Many gave similar answers, but one stood out. "Tell them we were ordinary men. Tell them courage is not a gift, it's a choice. And tell them we never felt mocked, because the men who mocked us didn't last long." He smiled when he said it, not with arrogance, but with the gentle certainty of someone who has seen the arc of history turn. The world eventually learned what the Germans learned in the dead of night. Mocking a commando never ended well. Because while others talked, they acted. While others doubted, they moved. While others laughed, they crossed the channel. And when dawn came, ports exploded, lines broke, and an empire's confidence crumbled. All because a small band of volunteers believed that courage mattered more than numbers. If you're watching this, if you remember that era, if you lost someone or loved someone who wore the uniform, thank you for keeping their memory alive. Like this video, subscribe to Ghosts of WWII, because every story we tell keeps their courage breathing another day. For those who remember, they never really left us. Not in spirit, not in legacy, not in the quiet places where history still echoes.